Hi, everybody. My name is Paul Miller. I'm the moderator on this session on editing and how to know when you're finished editing. I'm a producer and an executive. I've worked in the States, Europe, and the Middle East. I've made both feature films for studios and independent feature films with directors who had more or less final cut. And this is a sort of artistic exploration into knowing sort of creativity when you think you're done, and also a look at the business side when somebody may tell you you're done, or rather you're not done yet. And we've got three great people with us on the panel. The first person we'll speak to is Valerio Bonelli, who's a very established editor and has done everything from Incendiary by Sharon Maguire to Hannibal Rising, directed by Peter Weber, and more recently worked as a co-editor on The Martian for Ridley Scott, and also has edited quite a few documentaries. So he'll talk to us from an editing perspective. We're also joined by Melody London, who's live from Portugal, although I think she's based in New York. And she's done a whole host of things, everything from editing documentaries to working with Laurie Anderson, and I guess notably working with on 5 Jim Jarmusch films. And she's also a filmmaker, so we're also going to look at it in terms of the editor and director and that conversation that happens. And finally, we're joined by Mathieu Darras, who runs a series of talent and development labs and consultancies in Europe, and in particular is representing the First Cut Lab, which he'll speak to us about. And also importantly, you know, he's a programmer for festivals like Cannes Critics Week and the Venice Film Festival. And so he can give us a perspective of the programmer, what they see, and sometimes, of course, films are sent in, you know, in a rough cut or fine cut stage. So we're going to go in that sort of order. I'll kick off with Valerio. And what we're kind of do is we'll have the floor for 10 minutes for each person. And then at that point, I'll ask for people in the audience to send me questions, and I'll try and get those all answered. Sometimes I'll conflate them just to keep the pace going. And we're going to do this for about an hour, hour and a quarter, maybe a little bit longer. That's the plan. So Valerio, over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and hello everyone who's attending, and thank you for having me. Well, I mean, it's the question and the theme of this roundtable is very challenging in a way, because it's very intrinsic to filmmaking in itself, I think, and editing in itself. I mean, how long you can go editing a piece. In the early days of my career as a student, I immediately understood actually that you could go on forever, and you could go on for a long time cutting the same material. Often in the place in the school where I trained at the National Film and Television School, I remember clearly when we were put in front of an exercise of cutting the same material, the same footage, 5, 6, 7 different editors, and then we would show it at the end of the week into a screening theater, and it would be incredible how much this material was being modulated, stretched, cut, and interpreted in many different ways. So that was one of the first kind of time I kind of understood. All right, okay. So first of all, the editor is the ultimate writer of a piece, whatever it is, documentary, feature, or and then your personal interpretation, your personal interpretation of material comes across very, very much, even on a scripted piece. But with time, obviously, you then learn. There are several rules about when to stop, and I think in a way that you stop also when you run out of money in the big film. And not to break anyone's dream, but actually, yeah, when you come out of maybe a structure like film schools, and then you start working in the industry, you suddenly realize, okay, there's a budget, there's a time frame. And I mean, having said that, the film school was training us to this. You know, I came out in 2001 from the National Film and Television School, and they were even at the time they were quite good in giving us very strict time, you know, a schedule, and you know, you got to give your first cut into the first maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, depending how long the piece was. For documentary was always a bit longer. And then you have a first round of feedback notes, but ultimately then when you are confronted in the real industry and you have budgets and you have schedules to work to, it becomes a big, you know, it becomes your, let's say, perimeter, or in which you have to be very aware of. You have to find your way to feel that you have pushed the material enough to be able to explore every avenue. The funny thing is that with time, I think if maybe at the beginning of my career, I was a lot more kind of firm into my belief, okay, I think this scene needs to be cut like that. And I was very kind of maybe even a bit more quite dictatorial about it. And so that's the way it is. That's the way I like it. With time, I discover the pleasure of this, of exploring many possibility and many avenues, and manipulating an idea that maybe looked absolutely brilliant at first, and then suddenly discovering the process of cutting that there was a better way. There was a better way to cut it, better way to manipulate it. And I mean, I'm saying all of this like the work is just mine as an editor, but actually, obviously, it's not. There's a director, there's a producer, and there's an audience. On big films, when I work on big feature films, you know, like the one I did, I would say every feature film I worked on, starting, you know, when I worked with Stephen Frears on film like Philomena, for instance, we discovered very early on that the film was a crowd pleaser. And when we start showing it to the crowd, to the people, we learned so much information. We learned so many details about the film that we as filmmakers were not almost aware of. And so we had the chance to go back to the editing room and fine-tune many moments, comedy timing moment, drama moment, or sometimes we'd realize, okay, there, you know, we missed the point of that scene there, we need to readjust it. And then we went again and did another test screening, and suddenly, you know, even reactions and numbers came up. There's a whole chapter to open about, I don't know if this is the place to open about a previous screening and how, you know, producers use this previous screening to trying to force you and manipulate you into doing certain changes to the cut that maybe you don't want to do, but that's probably could be discussed into another.
Yeah, we can talk about it at the end because it's a very good point, but I think
but it's part of that time frame. I feel, I mean, on a romantic level, I feel that with most, I would say with 80% of the project and the film I've cut, I feel that I always have a moment towards the end where I feel I've done everything I could to be able to push and make the best film. And it doesn't always come in the same way. It's a different path, it's a different route every time. It's always something that comes out of many having done screenings and getting feedbacks from people, but then interpreting all of these feedback with your own mind and with the director to be able to make you know, still the film that was originally planned to be made, but fine-tuned to the best possible shape. there are some films that hardly needed any major adjustment. There's some film that I've been rewriting entirely in the cutting room. So it's very much hit and miss for me. I mean, so you know, I one film that I did with Stephen Frears on Lance Armstrong, we cut it, we even mixed it, and then we went, after 3 months, we went back and we reopened it and we recut it entirely, because the distributor and the producer were asking us to change, and yes, in the end we improved it. But that obviously needed injections of money, so it always comes somehow, in a horrible way, it always comes back to the money. It comes back to the fact that you know, you need to have the possibility to carry on cutting, and sometimes reshooting, and sometimes recutting needs reshoots. So I come from an Anglo-Saxon US type of filmmaking approach. So in the rest of Europe is different. Sometimes you have more kind of an auteur point of view, where the film is suddenly finished because the director says so. And that's almost very interesting. I'm sure some other colleagues might be able to talk about that process in a more explicative, you know, in a better way than me. I've always worked on film that had where somehow it's a game between me, the director, and the producers to be able to decide when we stop. And I would say that's more or less. I think it's the only way I've always done it, and I strongly believe this filmmaking is actually a process that includes a lots of people, collaborative process.
Maybe you could just add one thing, is that when is it that you make your, let's say in situations where you're the editor and the director's not over your breathing, over your shoulder, you're allowed to deliver a rough cut or something. How do you make that decision as to when you think you're done on pass one, shall we say? Is it something intuitive, or how do you gauge that?
Well, it has various stages, obviously. I mean, I start working on the first day of shooting, so I'm cutting along the way while the director's shooting. So I'm showing the director scenes the day after he shot them. Sometimes I work this way with Joe Wright, and I didn't work this way with Stephen Frears, because he didn't like to come in cutting during the shoot. But at the end of the shoot, I showed him an assembly, and that's a starting point, more or less, for me. I know that there's going to be a lot of changes, and I feel intuitively when I'm happy with the scene at a first pass of the scene. I read the script, I interpret the script in my mind. I look at all the footage, I look at all the performance, and I try to get a first impressions of that. And I look for one thing in every scene. I always believe that the script has if one scene has to tell one bit of the mosaic in the overall story, which I might get it wrong or might get it right and in my first cut of a scene, because at the end of the day, when you then see the film all together, you're right, okay, that scene, it's quite good, but I kind of missed this point. And then you can go back to it and readdress it when you have the full completed film. But normally I always work with instinct, and I always work with my narrative instinct and feeling that I know more or less I'm happy with the way a scene works from an emotional point of view, from a rhythm point of view, and mostly in the stage where we are shooting, it's to show it's also to give confidence to the directors and say, look, don't worry about all that stuff that you worry about. This is fine. And this is working, so keep going.
All right.
Post-production is a different beast,
yeah.
Which we can talk about it.
All right. Well, thanks, Valerio. That was super helpful and very interesting and insightful. So I appreciate that. And now let's go to Melody. Melody, do you want to just kick off, and then as we discussed, I can pop in with some questions as over the next few minutes.
Sure. Also, Thank you very much for inviting me to speak, and hello, everybody. I can't see who's out there, but I see there are 38 participants. So I actually started with an auteur. You know, Jim Jarmusch was the first person I ever worked with, and he ever since Stranger Than Paradise had final cut on his films. So really, we didn't have that kind of intervention from the producer or the distributors. In fact, with like Down by Law, the distributors came up with a poster that he just rejected and said, if you don't change the poster, you don't get the film. So we were really young, and I was quite impressed with that sort of audacious like attitude of this is my, you know, this is my vision. So I've worked with, you know, a number of people who are auteurs who, you know what they're doing, and they basically have final say as to what they're doing. You know, Laurie Anderson, David Byrne, you know, various people are people I've collaborated with. But I've also worked in the Hollywood system, and I just wanted to tell a little parable about somebody who it was his first film, and it was a big film. It was with Steve Martin and Helena Bonham Carter and Laura Dern. It was a huge opportunity for a first-time director. And he was very, very worried about making the right choice. And we literally would have like 135 versions of each scene, you know, because he wanted to explore which is impossible to do because there are infinite possibilities basically on how to cut a scene. But he was just not sure, and it was basically driving him mad how to make the right decision about how to cut the scene. And I would just say to him, the right decision is how you say is the right decision. You know, what you say is the right way, because there is no literal right way of stopping anyway. We also test market screened that film, and it was a dark comedy. And people are used to seeing Steve Martin not as a dark comedian, but as, you know, light and funny. And he wasn't. He was attracted to the role because it was serious. Anyway, it didn't score well, and it was a studio film. So they went back to the drawing board, rewrote backstory scenes. We reshot, we recut for another 6 months. And then we retest market screened the film, and it scored exactly the same. So, I mean, you know, it was interesting listening to Valerio talk about how things would actually improve. And I'm not saying they don't. Of course, they might, and they do. But in this case, it seemed to me that the DNA was absolutely, you know, written into this project. And it was what it was. I mean, we could have tinkered with it for another, you know, year and a half and changed the combination of the shots, but I mean, it just didn't change the overall impact of the film. And so I thought that was interesting because, you know, at some point you just have to let it go. And there was another determining factor with this film, which was the timing in which it came out, because it came out the year of the attack on the World Trade Center. And people just were not in the mood for a dark comedy at that time. It came out the same week as Harry Potter did, and that was a huge success. And so the film was just sort of cursed. And there was absolutely, you know, it had nothing to do with the editing or with the directing, actually, because it was a good director. He was a good director, really, really capable first-time director, but it kind of cursed his career from there on. So, you know, in terms of the editing process, you know, we really, I think we cut that film for almost a year and a half. It was being made with a studio that kind of forgot about us because we were in New York and they're in LA. And so we just were able to explore almost, you know, just many, 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 many different versions of the film, but it didn't change. That's my point. The overall impact of the film. It was, you know, just, it was within a certain genre and people just weren't responding to it. So anyway, I think that one of the things about screening a film is very important to do at a point when you think that you're finished with the film, like at a rough cut or approaching a locked picture stage. in my experience, it's good to bring in people, not in a general sense, like a test market. I mean, you know, I don't even know how often they do that now, but they used to actually like rate the film categorically. But if you have a prepared set of questions and you're open to change and you trust the people that you're asking, you know, their opinion on, I think it's very useful to have a screening before you lock the picture, and then, you know, make changes, and be open to them and not be so convinced about what you have. Listen to people and then make a decision from there on. It's also important, I think, to screen and project. I mean, you know, now a lot of films are done just on computers. People don't see the films projected. If it's meant to be theatrical, I think it's very important that you see a film projected from across a room. It has a different, the rhythms are very different. You can, you know, hold a shot for longer than you might think that you can if you're just working from a computer. And then also, I mean, in terms of documentaries versus features, because I worked on both, documentaries just take longer. They're usually, the editor is, I mean, the editor is I think of the edit as the final rewrite of the script if it's a dramatic film. But on a documentary, you're literally often, I have been the writer of the film also. So it just takes longer. And I think that, you know, there's more experimentation regarding the structure of the film and finding the film, really, because you're finding it as you're writing it, as you're editing it. You know, I just worked on a class in Portugal with students. It was called Doc Nomads. And so each of the students were making their own films, and they were quite diverse. And what was interesting to me was that some of the students wanted to just experiment and try things, and they were open to experimentation and reorganization of their projects, and really, and others were just not. They were happy with the film from the beginning, you know, almost from like, they didn't want to change it, they didn't want to try things. So, you know, when to stop is the question. And sometimes I worked on a film called Joe the King, and the director was ready to stop after the first assembly. You know, he just loved his material, and he was, you know, he just thought it was just perfect. And of course, the producer did not think that, you know, so anyway.
And how do you, just sort of as we get towards the end of it, maybe you can speak a little bit as a sort of with your director hat on, and how you feel that the sort of, how do you know when you're done might be different between being an editor, if there's something, or is it, or do you find it quite similar in the way you use your brain, shall we say?
I mean, what the films that I've directed have been done with grants, so it's so much determined by the financial reality of what I've had to work with, you know, and that's sort of a different, really arena of answers than, you know, if you're limited financially, then when it's a aesthetic decision, you know, because I basically, I'm working on a project right now where I'm working on it when I'm not working on an editing job that I'm getting paid to do. And so I try to make as much progress as I can. So, and it's taking a lot longer. You know, so.
Well, great. That's a great perspective. So thank you for that. So Mathieu, you're up, and maybe you want to tell us a little about your lab and your sort of point of view as a programmer, seeing probably films maybe not in a rough cut stage, but at a fine cut, or, you know, when people are trying to get their movie into a festival.
Yes. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me as well. Yes, it was very fascinating what Valerio and Melody said, and my take on it, my position is that I've been working for many years as a person supporting and accompanying talents through the development of the project, and for many years, along with my activities as a festival programmer. After the script was developed, after the shooting, people were coming back to me, and I found myself in the situation where I was spending as much time trying to give feedbacks in a hurry, maybe not with the best frame of feedbacks to people. And I was wondering, why is that? Why is this such a big need? Of course, mostly of debut filmmakers, but not only. And I was looking at the landscapes of support for films, and I found that basically this is something which is not existing, whereas a script development is very much, I mean, part of every film now is being developed through a lab. There was not such a thing for editing. So, and I talk about it to some people who are editors or also festival people, and we came together and we imagined that what it's probably something which is missing and could fulfill a need. And the big issue was what kind of frame to create, at which point to position the lab, with which people. Quite a lot was addressed already. And also I understood that why this kind of feedbacks in the circle of friends do not work is that people are too much connected to the filmmakers, whether it is a friendly relationship, a business relationship. So the lab, I think, proved to be useful because we were not on the side of anyone. We are not hired by producers or by anyone. Actually, we are taking on the side of the film, let's say. And the idea is to create a frame of exchange of feedbacks, which is both very protective and challenging. So because we are always looking at what could be best for the film. The other thing of the lab is the idea, and what I understood is that when people came to me, it's not necessarily that they want feedbacks to change, but sometimes they need validations of what they are doing. So such a lab could be useful not only when films have problems to be fixed, let's say, but it could be a natural step, like a moment in the film. I think it was Melody who talked about it, that it could be useful at some point to open it to other people. So that's why we started the lab 5 years ago, very much on a pilot mode with 2 or 3 films a year. But in the last 2 years, it has been like 30 and 40 films a year, and we work with about 7 different editors according of the film. My job is basically to match the right editor consultant to the right films, and also to look at when is the best time for the film and what kind of people to bring in the conversation. So we came up with a format. We tried different formats, and we are also exploring all the possibilities, especially for documentaries when, as Melody said, it's quite different. But for let's say the regular First Cut Lab, the idea is to have an editor consultant to run the table with 3 people from the industry, and the team of editor, director, and producer. And most importantly for us is to ask people of the industry, because they are used to know the dynamics of editing, how a film can evolve from the very first assembly to the final cut. But we don't ask them to talk as from their position in the industry, but mostly as the audience. For us, what's most important is that these 3 people are, let's say, sophisticated audience that can reflect and share what they view. And when it comes to the question of the panel and when to end the film, I think a lot has to do with the transformation or not of the initial intention of the filmmakers, and how the film evolves, and how the filmmakers are willing or not to embrace the change. And so it requires a lot of listening, the filmmakers, and also for them to discover what they really want to do, because it's a process that I was very familiar with in the stage of script development, but it's still clear that filmmakers get an understanding of the film at different stage, and editing is really an important one. And then later on, when it's on festival, through the question of the audience, they will also get a new understanding. So I guess that in this particular stage, the idea is to get people who are a bit distant from the production, but still are generous, let's say, and could give back this image of the film to the filmmakers, so they can sort of assess if their intention come along. Of course, it's also a question of clarity, but also as we work mostly with debut films, the magics of cinema, that basically the film transforms itself, and they need some time to digest if actually they are ready to accept a film that is different than what they imagined at the first place. So I think this is important. The other thing is that sometimes we open up some doors to teams who believe they explore everything, but it's sort of a collective brain to say, okay, maybe you can also try that or this. So I think we have very different cases where films have evolved dramatically, where we have toned down or up the actors, the main character, and the point of view. But sometimes at the end, there's been very little change to the lab didn't lead to major change, but I think it did lead to something which was at the beginning of the reason of this lab, this idea of validation, and for people to get confidence in their own materials, and also to be able to see that because they are not, as it was said, they are not necessarily sure how many possibilities there are, and sometimes it's good to explore other possibilities, to, let's say, to really embrace their film in the best way. So I think it's an important process as well to really stand for your film, and not only at this time of finishing a film, but it's like you're, especially with the first film, you're saying to the world who you are as a filmmaker. So you need to, especially editors at this point, have to help not only to find the solution, but to help the filmmakers to embrace this solution, so that that this way they can deliver the film more easily. So I think this is a lab helps also for that, which is very often the idea, and with experienced editors, it's not only to find the solution, but to tell or to lead the filmmakers to really adopt this solution. But I could talk for hours, because we do it differently, and this I love this lab, and I love how directly useful it is, and how each single case is different.
Maybe you could speak just briefly towards the end of the sort of 10 minutes about the sort of, when you see maybe even debut films that come in as a programmer, and they're sent maybe in advance of the deadline for a sense of how the film's going, and they're wanting your opinion. Is there some criteria you have in terms of advice you give, or do you just, how does that process work?
Well, I mean, I don't want to say something definitive about people in the industry, but we have been, let's say, trying out more than 200 people. Usually there are producer, sales, festival people. And festival people, even if they are used to watch rough cut, quite few of them, but some of them prove me wrong in the sense that they're extremely extremely smart in the dynamics of the film, but usually festival programmer have a more static and final vision of a film. So it's a little bit like sales. For example, if they have seen a film and they're not really convinced, it will be very difficult to make them watch the film again, which is, I guess, is different from producers who have a practical experience of how a film can evolve. So this is from the side of the festival that, but people cannot really know. I mean, me, I got to know it just by experience of working with different people, and this not always the most prestigious place have the most smart view of editing as a dynamic process. The other thing from the side of filmmakers is that, I mean, as you said, I used to work for Venice, Cannes, and San Sebastian, and sometimes filmmakers especially see festival selection as a validation that the film is perfect, which is by far not the case. So I think it's very important. Of course, as a filmmaker, you get mostly negative answers all along the way. So when you have a yes, it feels good, but I think it should really not feel like it's necessarily the end of the editing, so that the film is selected. Some filmmakers are pretty smart in this regard. Someone like Agnieszka Holland, our last film, which was in Berlinale, it was shown in the version of 2 hours 40, and then it was distributed as 2 hours 15. So yes, I think the festival is still not the place where you necessarily log the film. And just the last thing I want to add is that from the position of the industry, I think Melody and Valerio as editors feel that their part of the process is expensive. They talk a lot about money, but I would say just the opposite, that the editing is the cheapest process of the filmmaking. So actually you can make a film so much better when you dedicate more time to it. So this is really really a space where I could see how you can gain from the production point of view in terms of quality of the film. My school of learning has been this company co-production office that is still working a lot, and it's impressive how they can keep films on hold in editing for 1 or 2 years and achieve really better results. So, but once again, there's not one. It's always many different cases, but from my experience of the lab, now we have been working with more than 150 films. You have often people who are very optimistic about when they are going to finish the film, and so it's good for them to plan more time, I would say.
Well, great, Mathieu. Thank you for that. Just before we open up some questions, and for those viewers, please have one from Gonzalo, but please, everybody else, pop in your questions. It occurs to me that there's sort of one of the key things in editing and filmmaking in general is communication, and the idea that everybody especially in the sort of producer, writer, editor sort of triangle, that everybody's actually wanting to make the same film. And I've also even, and I think this idea of sharing with an audience when you think you're ready to get that feedback, because ultimately, film is a collaborative art and you want it to be seen. Even if it's a small audience, you still want the film to be seen. And like Melody, I also worked with an American filmmaker who had more of his final cut called John Sayles. And even though we were not forced, but advised to do test screenings, he was always interested, not maybe for artistic reasons, but he always wanted to know that people understood it, that it was not a comprehension issue. And I think that's almost the bottom line, and why, you know, and if you want to be obtuse or elliptical, fine, but make that a conscious choice, not because generally people are like, I have no idea what just happened. And I think that you know, that's almost a baseline for your audience. After that, then one can have conversations about the artistic merits of a certain director's vision, or in the case of test screenings, what you want to hit a number. I mean, before we started, I did a movie called Prozac Nation, and we tested it 9 times. But I have to admit, you know, each time we showed it and we cut it, I sat at the back of the room, and you saw by the end of it, people were laughing where we wanted them to laugh and getting upset and very still and quiet when that was the case. So the film did, as a piece of communication with an audience, you know, work better. And I think that's, you know, certainly as a producer, that's a criteria for me, is that has the director, has the filmmaker team, you know, communicated what they wanted to the audience, and whether they're getting that back. And for me, that's sort of one area in which I think, okay, we're getting close to, you know, being done with this, rather than it being a numeric thing of, you know, 85% of people would say, you know, very good, they'd recommend it to their friend, which is the sort of the baseline in the States, or on a more artistic level or tour level, where the director feels that his or her vision is as well done as possible. So let me just throw out some questions here. So here's a good question. Gonzalo is asking, as an editor, one of the hardest things to look at the material from a first-time observer while being surrounded by all the material for months. At the same time, that is one of my favorite things as being an editor, to pay attention to every detail and how can it affect differently the audience. Do you have any tips on how to distance yourself more effectively from the material while working on it for such a long time? So I'll throw that one to Valerio and Melody.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very interesting question, because it is, I think every editor I met or I worked with when I was an assistant, and then when I became myself an editor, I realized that everyone has used different techniques to actually kind of refresh your brain and gain clarity and gain a new innocence towards the material. Also, I would say it comes with experience. With the more you do it, the more I feel that I have, I know that I know how to see material with new eyes and with new perspective. Generally, I would say that the way to do this is by showing the films, actually, either to friends or screening it to maybe a test screening. I mean, as Paul was saying, the numbers are numbers. You have to kind of ignore them. Marketing people love to do all those charts, sending them to you, telling you graph. I mean, the Hollywood studios have tried for years to turn an art form into a science. And it's very much that, you know, they think that if you tweak this, if you have this, and if you have that, and then sometimes you're like, but you know, maybe sometimes you wonder even if the executive of the studio have read the script, because they're asking us to make changes that are not even in the script originally. So then you start to understand that it's seen, the film at some point is for some people involved in the process of making this film, is seen as a product. So the thing I really like about sitting in a room with, even in the most ghastly, I mean, in my careers, I had to go to places like Kansas City, to LA, in the Valley, or to watch a film with people completely strangers. And it's a scary process, but I find it really exciting, because you sitting in the, I normally sat in the middle, confuse myself with the crowd, and I feel the vibes. And it's almost like the first time I look at the film as a film through the eyes of other people. And I can feel the vibration when they get bored, when they're enjoying, when they discomfort. And then I think as an editor and director, you have to take all this feedbacks, almost forget about the cards, and feel that, you know, because ultimately, you know the film, you've seen all the takes, you've seen all the footage. And after, to refresh my brain, I go back to the rushes, and I go back and look at rushes, and I go back and look at different performance, so that I can re-elaborate a scene in a way that maybe I didn't think of it before, thanks to a certain feeling I had during a screening. This is in feature, really, but obviously different genres have different way of refreshing. Generally, throughout every genre, I always think going back to the footage is the way. You know, you should never, as an editor, you should never feel that what you put down is your boundary. The boundaries are large. You should always go back to the material and see and find other inspiration in the material. As a documentary editor, also, I can share my experience. Last year, I cut during the pandemic. My wife is a documentary filmmaker. We did a 5-part series, the first doc series for Italian Netflix, and called Sampa. It was a very engaging documentary about a drug addiction place called San Patrignano, which saved more than 3,000 people from heroin addiction in the 80s, but used very controversial methods. I.e., sometimes they used to chain people. So it was very, very hot subjects, and we had incredible footage, archives, and the process with Netflix was incredibly strange, I would say, because they wanted 5 revisions, very kind of close to each other across of each episodes. And I would say maybe in the first 2 revisions, they were very light. And then at the 3rd time, they hit hard like crazy. And they were like, oh, wow, they said they loved the film and now they hate it. And so, you know, it was quite interesting to see how they didn't hate it, but they were like much more critical and maybe into details as well, which sometimes can feel, you can feel quite, you know, attacked by, and I would say even there, the answer was always never address the specific notes, but always try to understand where the specific notes come from. Maybe they haven't understood something earlier or after. Maybe the storytelling wasn't quite right. So you have to go back and readdress with your own mind and without being, you know, it's not a laundry list. I never see notes as a laundry list to do, because if you do that as an editor, I think then you kind of go down into a very dangerous territory where you're not.
Would you see it more as the notes more as a conversation, should be as part of a conversation rather than do this, do this, do this? Is that?
Yes, and I mean, you know, obviously there has been occasions. I mean, I had a horror story like Melody that she had that, and I spent the whole 2018 stuck in New York doing a film for Scott Rudin, and I was literally you know, I was supposed to be there 6 months. I was there for 1.5 years, and it was a horrible experience. I never earned that much in my career, but I would say I'll never do that again. Because I mean, I loved being in New York. I was away from my family, and it wasn't great for that. But you know, Joel Wright was the director. We shot the film. We cut it like he wanted, like we wanted. We had amazing music from Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, which was brilliant. We previewed, and the numbers were horrible. But they weren't horrible because the film was horrible. It was horrible because it wasn't ticking some boxes of the studio. This is a popcorn movie. They wanted Girl on a Train. We were doing Gone Girl kind of thing. Yeah. And David Fincher is another one that, you know, if he goes to preview, it's funny because when we went to LA, we went to talk to David, and because Joe knows David, and we had a long chat with him, and he told us about Seven. Seven was a film that was previewed 42, I think, and then it became one of the biggest cult in history of cinema, I would say. So yeah, the film I'm talking about is Woman in the Window, which had an incredible ordeal process going. You know, it was exactly the same as Melody. I mean, we screened, we previewed twice, same numbers, a bit better, 3, 5, 6 points more. And then they hired a major new writers, rewrote, I would say, 1/3 of the movie, spent another $10 million. We went to preview with changing even the composer, and then they scored 1 point more,
Right.
which was like the craziest process I've ever been into my career. I remember at the end of that preview, me and Joe were like laughing like kids because they basically spent $10 million for 1 point. And they kept on saying, the studio, they kept on saying to us, it's better, but it's better. And they say, I don't know. I mean, it's like, you tell me it's better, but I liked it better before when it was more edgy and more weird and a bit more, you know, made the audience a bit more uncomfortable. And, you know, this is, they never learn. I think it's a process that, because somehow, obviously, they, as I was saying before, it's stronger than them. They see it, they see the film as a things to sell, the studio. At some point, they have to go into that mentality of and I mean, you know, this is just a small thing, but it's true that the editing process doesn't cost very much compared to shooting. That's in every level. But still, when you're on a film like for instance, I just finished Cyrano, it's a musical. I had a team of like 2 music editors on, the sound people on. When at some point, it would cost about 70 grand, 80 grand a week. That's a lot of money still. And if you work on a big budget film, you know, the editorial thing towards the, I would say after director's cut, it start to be quite expensive as well, including visual effects team that, you know, and then you start to change visual effects, you have to take your responsibility. I'm kind of trying to answer a question about visual effects. I mean, that's kind of another thing that, I mean, some other colleagues have more experience than me because I never done any kind of back-to-back green screen films, but yeah, that's a whole new that's a whole different territory. And in fact, as far as I know, some of this Marvel film, they don't even preview them because they know that they can't preview, they can't afford to go into a preview. They just do them and then release them. And
it's almost like animation. You just you have to have planned and film out before you make an animated film. You can't go back and recut a scene. It doesn't work like that. Well, one question here that's kind of interesting that I thought was, somebody said, do you have any tricks or rules that you set to yourself while editing? I'll just, while you think about that, I just read an article about the guy who directed Summer of Soul, which is about a music festival in New York in the 60s. And he said he projected the film on his wall on a continuous loop of 100 hours. And what he would do is every time he happened to wander by it or wake up or something and saw something that was interesting, he wrote down the time code. And that's how he selected, you know, enough footage to just begin to make the film, which was a technique I've never heard of before. So
I like watching every film I cut. I like watching them at the end of the process without sound. I just love to see the visual rhythm of, even if it's a dialogue scene, it's something always interests me.
Yeah, that's funny. I watch the dailies like that. I watch it without sound.
Yeah, I mean, also in some dialogues in particular, they're quite interesting because by the end of the process, I know what they're saying. I can hear it in my ear, but by not hearing, I pay more attention to poses and to moments of, you know, where, oh, well, actually, maybe if I add 15 frames to that shot, that moment it gets better, or reducing it. So that's one.
And Melody, do you have any things like that? You do anything?
Tricks?
Tricks or just I don't know, little devices that you play with. Well,
I know Walter Murch was always suggesting having a little character, but you know, so that you're, you know, or a figure. In other words, you're seeing the film always from the audience's perspective, not so much through your own eyes. You know, you try to see things. Because obviously I'll be seeing something 100,000 times, whereas somebody else will see it once. So, you know, I mean, you try to make sure that things are coherent from the perspective of an audience. You just have to have fresh eyes constantly. And I agree with Valerio that comes with time in a way. I mean, it's ironic because, you know, the more that I've worked on films, the more that I understand how to divorce from them emotionally and just see them completely in a neutral kind of fashion with fresh eyes, you know. And whether or not, I mean, I worked on a film with Rebecca Miller, and Arthur Miller, you know, the great playwright, came in and suggested that one of the scenes be taken out that cost the most money, but it wasn't serving the story. That particular scene wasn't serving the story, so take it out, regardless of how incredible it was, that it, you know, how wonderfully it was shot and how expensive it was to get that shot, et cetera, et cetera. You know, serve the story. How do you serve the story? You know, and not be attached to one of the actors or one of, you know, it's just, it's really a kind of dispassionate sort of exercise, you know, that you have to maintain. So, and that does, in a way, I think, come with time, you know, so it has for me anyway.
All right, thank you. We have another question here about storyboards and whether you use storyboards to when you're editing or perhaps.
I want to say, I mean, I think that with a documentary in particular, having index cards and having a kind of map of the structure can be very, very helpful. I actually like to print out, you know, a visual reference to each card so that you can look at it as if it's a storyboard that was written for a dramatic film, but it's index cards that reflect the structure that you're working with and how to then possibly, you know, restructure it, move things around, and look up at the wall and see how that looks, you know, and how it's playing. And I love the idea. I do want to say I love the idea of looking at the film that Valerio mentioned, Silent, and that was something that I had to do with this film that I did with Laurie Anderson, Heart of a Dog, because she is a musician and she knew how the music would fill out the film. I actually never heard it until it was finished, but of course she heard it because she's a composer and a musician. So some of the shots we had to keep very, very long, what seemed like, you know, an unusually lengthy length, but with the knowledge that would somehow be, you know, dealt with on a musical level. So there was just, you know, a trust inherent in that, you know, that it would come about. Yeah.
And maybe I'll ask also to go to sort of segue back a little bit to the topic, is it, you know, how often do you find that you're told to stop editing when you feel there's more in the material? Is that in your careers happened most of the time, or do you feel that there's enough collaboration between the writer, director, producer, financier, that everybody's kind of on the same boat, or is that has that not been the case? Or
I mean, I just actually I had a situation where the proposal was 12 weeks for a feature film that's being done, you know, with CGI and it, you know, I mean, it's huge. The script was incredibly ambitious, and they're talking about 12-week edit. You know, it's just, I mean, I know that that's not doable. And so, yeah, I mean, sometimes I do think that I agree that often editing is where people try to cut the producers try to, or whoever is making the budget tries to cut the costs the most, because they want the money to go to big actors, because the big actors get the film made, you know, and that's what's happening in this case. But I just know it would be a punishing experience to try to deliver that. Yeah. So.
This is a little. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I mean, I in terms of the screenwriter, director, you know, the process of, it has happened to me that often on a couple of occasions we made choices during the editing process that has been radically different from the original script, and then you have this awkward moment where you're showing the film to the screenwriter, and suddenly it's like, sorry, this is not my film, and this is not, and it happens, and you know, and that informs sometimes reshoots, or informs the that there has to be some changes. The thing is that it is inevitable that the script changes into different shapes, because it filters through so many people, the director, the actors, the production designer, everyone who touches the script and put his input in, and then he goes into the editing room once it's shot. So it's absolutely normal that then, but I mean, my experience with screenwriters has always been quite you know, I mean, I could tell an anecdote on Philomena. We changed something very radically that at first the writers didn't, I wouldn't say like, but they were like a bit like, you know, they felt it wasn't part of the way of the nature of the way they scripted the story. But then that sparked an ideas, and somebody like Stephen Frears always keeps money aside for at least 3 days of reshoot, because he knows that during the editing process he will find things that he didn't think before. So every time his producer knows from the beginning that they have to put a certain percentage of the budget aside so they can go, you know, and address any issue. And that comes through, you know, us battling and discussing in the editing room, and putting cards, putting storyboard images. I didn't offer with line, or even going into ADR with the actors, and maybe a new scene has been written and you kind of mock it up in the cutting room so that you can see it, and then you can kind of feel that if that can work. So that's definitely part of the process, to be able to get to a stage where you can say, I'm done.
Yeah. And maybe this is a small segue into sort of a similar question to the overarching one, is that, you know, there's usually a great pressure from producers and from distributors to make things shorter. You know, I think I read somewhere that with the advent of word processors and computers, scripts have gotten longer and longer and longer because people just open up on Final Draft and the scripts are longer. The movies have gone from 90 minutes to 2 hours to longer and longer. And I know that almost every movie I've produced, there's been pressure from somewhere to say, you know, can it be shorter? And I wondered if you guys would kind of address that a little bit. And yeah, I just made not that this was the pressure, but I just made a feature film that's on release in the States, and it's 76 minutes long, I think. So it's really short. But that was the length it turned out at, you know, and it was good like that. So I just wondered if, and I guess an example of something like, you know, Blade Runner or the Agnieszka Holland reference, where you have these things that are well over 2 hours, and there's this enormous pressure ultimately from distributors to make them shorter. And I just wondered, as an editor, how you saw that, or indeed, Mathieu, from your workshop. I'm sure there's a tendency first-time filmmakers to have longer than it might arguably need to be.
I think if we analyze the intellectual process, it's far more frequent to ask for something shortened, because the mind reacts to what you have seen. So you can identify moments in the film where you feel that there's a problem of rhythm, that something is unnecessary, and it's far more difficult to imagine the opposite process. And often the people who give feedbacks don't have access to all the existing parts. So that's, I mean, if we put even aside the commercial aspect of the less than 110 minutes to do different screenings per day in cinema, but this is only natural to look for something shorter when it takes a lot of experience to understand that something longer will feel shorter, will feel more compelling. So this is one thing. But which is also connected to the idea of reshoot, because very interestingly, in the last 2 years, we have had in the lab much more films that were partially edited because they had to interrupt the shooting because of the pandemics. And I'm glad about this anecdote of Stephen Frears. And before the pandemics, we had such a film where intentionally they did it, and it was an exception. And it helped so much to rewrite the script through the lab and to analyze what would make sense, because it's very often a question of understanding, and it improves so much. So that's all, but it's connected to the impulse of shortening, because sometimes when things don't work and there's not possibility of reshot, we say, okay, this has to be cut. But I mean, I also come across very often, I think it's this sort of lab brings a sort of a neutrality in the conversation, which is very beneficial to me, because sometimes filmmakers feel they are threatened in their integrity because they are being asked to shorten. So when there are people who are a little bit outside of the process and say it would actually be better for your film, it can help. Sometimes even if they have a good relationship, the producer and director, it could be seen as an issue.
Yeah.
But another trend, and I would like to finish with that, is that I feel like the young filmmakers are more and more negatively aware of the industry, so that they tend to they have interiorized all of this, like if we talk about people who feel a little bit the integrity of their vision is threatened. Nowadays, I feel like the filmmakers, they really want to please, and sometimes they are actually cutting themselves from the potentiality of their films because they want to please. And it's also difficult to the kind of feedbacks you give, because people sometimes they integrate these feedbacks too much. So it's almost that the opposite trend as what you get to use a few years back. Really, this is very massive. People, emerging filmmakers who really want to please and would change the ending and one thing and the other, and it's problematic as well.
That's a very interesting observation. I mean, I wanted to just ask also Melody and Valerio the same thing about being short. And something occurs to me is that sometimes something I feel that visual literacy has become so advanced, and I think sometimes as filmmakers we forget how quick an audience is. You can cut from the guy in the car to a guy in the room. You don't need to see him walk up the path and put the key in the door. I mean, that's a bad example, but I do sometimes think that the comprehension of audiences is actually more than we as sort of filmmakers, producers actually realize. And sometimes that's an impetus to shorten it without even being able to articulate it that way. So maybe Melody, you want to comment on that?
Well, I have to say, I mean, some of the films that I've worked on have predetermined lengths, like it's contractual. So it's been difficult to actually fit it into that kind of parameter, because the producer is absolutely, just beholden to this 90-minute length. But I'm just thinking about the film Down by Law, where it was, for example, felt like it was running too long, but the way that it was conceived of was these kind of, stories with these motifs within the prison sequence, that whole scene. And we had to lose one of those little, nuggets in order to shorten it. It couldn't be there just wasn't that much coverage to really, nip and tuck. So the one scene that we had all gotten so tired of, I don't know if you've seen the film, but is the I scream, you scream, we all scream for ice cream. And then Wim Wenders called up and said, you cannot take that out. You can't take that out. And ironically, that is the scene that most people quote from that film that they remember. So that was the scene that we were willing to give up because it was the longest, and, we were just tired of hearing it, and because the editing process had gone on for a while. So, it's very interesting what Mathieu was just saying, because, I've worked with a lot of young people recently, and what they say, first of all, is like, how long do you want it to be? Like they say that first. Like, I don't think like that, let it be as long as it wants to be, and then start thinking about it, then start addressing it. Is that working like that? Could that, length change, etc. But not to say in advance, okay, this is going to be a 7-minute scene. I just don't think that way. And they do. they've somehow internalized this idea of, okay, we're going to deliver something at this length and that's what it's going to be, you know, so.
I noticed something through my teenage children that I'd never noticed. I mean, it's quite interesting, but I think there's an obsession with time. I mean, the thing about length in films, I think, is that you know, it's very much, in my opinion, it's very much connected to the format on how you watch film. You know, I still come from a generation where we had to go to the cinema. You sit down in the cinema, there's no escape. I mean, you can get out if you don't like the film, but you know, you're kind of forced in this dark room to watch something. It's all the magic, all the romanticism around. I brought my kids to the cinema. They liked it, but then, you know, they are surrounded, and we are all surrounded by many screens all the time. So, you know, they watch YouTube, they watch Vimeo, they watch Instagram things. So, and I think it's true that there's a new generation that is used to faster storytelling, and sometimes, in my opinion, maybe I'm already getting old, but a bit too short. I do try to get my children to see old movies, and the other day, I was completely shocked. I found my son watching a Netflix show at double speed, and I thought it was crazy. I thought he was absolutely insane. And I said, "Why are you watching at double speed?" And he said, "Oh, I can watch more episodes." And I mean, honestly, I felt so offended, and so. But then the day after, I need to understand this. You know, I need to understand where this come from. Where is this need of getting, you know, with length, with time? I think it's very much to do with the fact that we live in a world where there's so much information, and there's so much way to get information, and to, you know, visual information particularly. We're in a society that is obsessed with visual information. Well, it didn't used to be like that when I was young in the 80s and 90s. So I'm curious how film is going to change in relation to that. I hope it's not going to die. I don't think it's going to die. I think it's going to evolve. But I do think it might evolve to have shorter maybe length. But it's true. Audiences are much more smart. They can jump in their head. But ultimately, you still have to tell a narrative story. So no matter what you do, you still have to kind of put the audience behind in order for them to get to keep their interest going. I do slightly miss, I have to say, and being honest about it, I do slightly miss the innocence of the audience that used to go to the theaters, because it belonged to my generation, and I've seen the change because I'm 45, so I could see. I've seen even the end of film cutting to digital cutting, and as an editor, this is a whole. You know, maybe you, Felipe, can do a whole panel on this. But I believe actually digital editing in many ways have stopped young editor from learning the craft, because the simple match frame button operation that I can do now in the Avid and look and open a bin and finding a close-up, I needed an assistant to do that in the old days. And that assistant was sitting next to the editor, looking at the process, seeing how the editor interacts with the director, witnessing the creative moment, and using his brain to say, oh, my task is to go and look for close-ups for the director and the editor who are looking for a close-up. And he would do it. Yeah. Having eliminated all of these steps, technical, it seems technical, it's being a disaster, in my opinion, in film editing, in the way film editing is being taught from generation to generation. And assistants now sit in another room doing technical stuff, and it's a disaster because they don't learn narrative editing. They don't learn how to grow or how to witness, and they don't see the actual editing process being happening. Maybe they see the cuts. So there's a lot of, it sounds like I'm against digital technology, but I'm not. I love it, obviously, because I do my work very quickly with it. But I think there has to be an impetus in you know, even in the National Film School. I always say God, you got to make exercise. You have to teach some certain exercise that allow the student to understand the process of film editing, and we have to find new way of teaching the art of narrative editing to young generation. Yeah. Because otherwise we're going to lose an entire an entire kind of school. I was very sad to see old editors, for instance, in countries like Italy, for instance, where the old editors that worked on film were completely swept away at some point because they couldn't adapt to digital technology. I thought that was a disaster. That was sad. Yeah. And there wasn't an industry behind that would protect them, like in America, for instance, because I mean, you know, if you take somebody like Michael Kahn, who's been cutting for Spielberg for like 20 years, 30 years, he doesn't touch the machine, but he sits with somebody who touched the machines for him. I would never be able to do that, but I've always been very respectful and interested in the way that that process happened, because it was it allowed somebody else to learn, and it allows him to stay in the industry and keep and carry on working. He's a brilliant editor, so why should he stop working just because computers now are used? So
thanks, Valerio. So we're sort of running at end of time. There's one last question, which is a little bit off topic, but I thought it was a fun question from an anonymous attendee. He's a director, and his question was, how do you choose the right editor?
I mean, it's a feeling. It's a relationship. It's a sense that you have after meeting people. You have to meet with them, talk to them, and feel it out. See how, you know, who you're going to be comfortable with. And I think that's the essential. In a small dark room for many, many months.
Exactly. I mean, at the end of it, I remember asking this question to Joe Wright. They say, why did you choose me? And he answered me, because I thought I can spend 6 months with this guy. Only for that, and then not because I'm of course, because you're good and that. But you know, I think that's. I mean, it goes vice versa. I mean, I found myself in that position too often to say, do I really want to spend
exactly
7 months with this person?
Yeah.
7 months minimum.
Yes. And Mathieu, just I'm interested to hear if you have any thoughts on that. Maybe you, through your lab, you experience sort of matches that don't fit. You know.
Of course, I experience because it's a matter of development and people you get to know along the way. And if you do the wrong meetings, it's mostly because you don't know what is good for yourself. I think the editor who is good for you are you looking for someone who create contrast, who will oppose you, someone who will validate what you are you looking for new ideas, you know, depending on what you're looking at. And I had the experience of directors who, because it's often in this sense, directors who felt they had a fine relationship with the editor, and when our editor consultant came in the lab, they realized, oh my God, this is what a relationship with an editor could be, and it could be much better than this. So I understand that it's a tricky question, because it's, you know, like an actor, it's much more easy to understand for a director if you want to have such a sort of a persona. For an editor, if you haven't grown up together inside a film school, or it's a very big decisions to make.
But I guess it's about the personal connection, and it's going back to that idea of communication again, that you can communicate with somebody on a level that's beneficial for the film and for you as a person, as an artist. Does anybody? We're sort of at time now, and if anybody has any sort of final thoughts, this would be the time to express yourself. And if not, we can say I want to thank all the attendees for their questions. They were really good, and some, sorry if I couldn't get to all of them, but we try to cover as much material as possible. And so if Melody or Valerio or Mathieu, you have any final sign-off comments, now's your moment. And if not, I will finish off by saying thanks very much, everybody. I really appreciate it. It was a really great panel. I thought it was a lively conversation. And thanks also for your anecdotes from within the industry and also hearing about your lab, Mathieu. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Ciao, bye-bye.